everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 325 libraries across the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator, in conversation with each of the wonderful, best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series year-round. Today, we are happy to welcome psychologist and New York Times best-selling author Adam Alter to talk to us about his most recent book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough: How to Get Unstuck When It Matters Most. Welcome, Adam. How are you?
Hi, Brandon. Thanks very much for having me, and thanks to all of you joining for taking time. I'm sure you're very busy, so I really appreciate it.
And likewise to you. We appreciate your time, so thank you for being here.
Sure.
I know that everybody's super excited to get started, but before we begin, I need to pause so that I can give that standard information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then we will jump right in. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but as always, we'll be taking your additional questions throughout our conversation. So when you have a direct question for Adam, you can click that questions button that's just below this live stream. There are 3 tabs there. One says questions. You can do that at any time to submit your question. Please keep in mind, though, there are quite a few of you tuning in, so we'll get to as many questions as we can over the 60 minutes. If you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours, and within that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Adam Alter is a professor of marketing and the Stansky Teaching Excellence Faculty Fellow at the New York University's Stern School of Business. He also holds an affiliated professorship in social psychology at NYU's Psychology Department. In 2020, he was voted Professor of the Year by the faculty and student body at NYU's Stern School of Business, and was among the Poets and Quant's 40 Best Professors Under 40 in 2017. Alter is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 books, Drunk Tank Pink and Irresistible, and then, of course, the book of note today that we are going to discuss. Again, thank you again for being here. So,
thank you for having me.
I think that because we have so many great questions for you today, that I think that it's best if we just kind of dive right in. Can you give, I know the majority of people on today have read the book, but can you give a quick synopsis of your book, and then we'll dive into kind of questions section by section?
Yeah, sure. So the nice thing about being a psychologist and an academic psychologist is you can investigate all the things that are most interesting to you, and they're very down-to-earth things. And so over time, I've been interested in all sorts of things: how we spend our time, how we spend our money to maximize our welfare. But one of the things that's come up in my career over the last 20, 25 years over and over again is that people are often frustrated and stuck, and also seem to some extent blindsided by that, even though they know that it's ultimately inevitable. It's an essential part of life. And one of the nice things about being a scientist who studies human behavior and the human experience is you can ask scientific questions about problems that seem to many people intractable, impossible of being solved, or incapable of being solved. And that's true of stuckness. Like, I think a lot of people think of stuckness as this kind of mystical thing. Like, why am I here? It feels so personal. It's so upsetting. It's true for individuals, and it's true for organizations and governments and lots of other bodies that are larger. And so the book is essentially an attempt to take that 25 years of interest and distill a sort of roadmap for getting unstuck. And so it's structured that way. It's almost like a recipe guide for getting unstuck. And then the last thing in the book is that instead of a traditional epilogue, I thought I would just summarize the book in an epilogue that says, here are 100 ways to get unstuck. And I kind of distill the main ideas from the book and present them that way. So it really is it's a much more practical book in many ways than the first couple of books I wrote. And it is really just a guide for moving through those periods when we all feel that we can't move forward.
So can I just say that your conclusion is the best conclusion I've ever seen. You're just so succinctly summarizing the points that you made in the book and listing it out for us. So you're not making people go back and search for it after they've read the book a couple of times. You kind of know where to find it, but I mean, the anecdotes and the examples and the interviews that you have are amazing. So you need to read the book all the way through, but the conclusion is incredible.
Thank you. Thank you.
So What's the difference then between being stuck and bad luck? So you open the book with the story about Oscar-winning actor Brie Larson, um, and how nobody's seen like kind of the ups and downs that she had throughout her career. But I guess you could argue that that could also be seen as bad luck because she still seemed like she was out there doing it. So what is the difference between those two?
I think bad luck can cause you to be stuck, but stuckness comes from all sorts of different sources. Some of them are internal, they're motivational, they are just the way life happens to be in any particular moment. It doesn't have to be about luck specifically, but a lot of the time it is something that we would think of as luck-based, some external force that we haven't invited into our lives. It could be about health, it could be about finances, it could be about career decision-making, relationships that go awry, things like that. So in Brie Larson's case, I don't think I'm not, I mean, certainly you could interpret her early struggles as bad luck, but I think every single actor, that this is sort of the point of the story, that every single actor experiences some form of frustration and hardship on the road to success. Some of them don't succeed, but even the ones who do, even the ones who succeed in the greatest way possible, which is what you could say about her career. She's
Mm-hmm.
fabulously wealthy on the back of her career and has won all sorts of awards. She had, by her own accounting, 98 to 99% of the time, she failed, as she described it, to get the role that she was auditioning for. I don't think that's bad luck. I think it's baked into the process. But she still, what I like so much about her videos on YouTube is she has these two videos that I talk about where she takes something that's usually so opaque from the outside and makes it transparent and shows the rest of us that even the very most successful people in a field were stuck, and sometimes for years. And that's why I begin the book that way, not just with Larson, but with others.
Yeah, it's an amazing way to start the book because typically all we hear about are the success stories and not the in between to getting there. It makes you feel so disconnected to some of these things, like, it must just be me, but it's not. It's everybody.
I think that's right. I mean, you think about the Instagram age in particular, that we share the very best, sort of the cream of our lives, the very best little bits. And so we're all swimming in everybody's best lives, but we know that our own lives are a little bit messier. And I think that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So the structure of your book, you've broken your book into four parts, kind of the four H's, if you will: help, heart, head, and habit. So I guess just starting with help and going through the sections one by one, Annette would like to know, why do people get stuck to begin with? Why is getting stuck inevitable?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I spend quite a lot of time in the book talking about exactly that. And as I said earlier, there are two essential causes of stuckness: external and internal causes. So those are the two kinds of things that can happen. There's a lot of research on the sort of the course of a lifespan, what happens, and it's usually change, uninvited change, that causes us to feel stuck, because something that was effective and was working the way you wanted it to at one point in your life will stop working. A great example of this that I think we can all identify with is whatever structures we had in place before the pandemic didn't work quite so well and needed to be revised when we were experiencing the pandemic. It changed the way we worked, interacted with other people or didn't, parented our children if we had kids. It really sort of threw a spanner in the works. And it's not just the pandemic, but on an individual level, all sorts of things befall us that force us to change. And so that's the external side. There's also a huge amount of research looking at how the same thing that's effective for a certain period of time in our lives, a strategy or an approach to learning a language, exercising, whatever it is, there is a very well-known, robust general phenomenon known as the plateau effect, which suggests that humans stop responding to the same approaches if we just keep applying them over and over and over again in lots of different domains of our lives. And that means you have to be nimble. And so you get stuck just by virtue of trying to do the same thing over and over again and being efficient and not changing your strategies. And it's human nature just to keep doing a thing as much as possible without having to revise it, because that means you don't have to expend more effort than necessary. And so that plateau effect combined with these vast changes, and the biggest changes, that one of the terms that's used to describe them is life quakes. Bruce Feiler, a writer who's talked to a lot of people about their experiences of life, says that on average, roughly every 5 to 10 years, we experience a colossal shift in our lives, and he calls them life quakes. And they also force us into a position where we're stuck. So I think for all of us, we're stuck constantly for all sorts of different reasons that are internal and external.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, the plateau effect. I've definitely heard it applied in like an exercising realm, but I never thought of it being applied just to life in general, to things that we were doing in general.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it applies very, very broadly. There's a lot of research on cognitive skill acquisition. So as you get better at something, the same strategies that were working when you were a novice just don't work anymore. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, intuitively, if you're learning a language, there are certain things you do when you're first learning the language that become less effective when you want to develop further. And so the plateau arises when that steep learning curve is replaced by what feels like a period of stasis where you're not making much more progress. So I think it does apply quite broadly beyond just the physical domain.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because then people, you're really, really, say you're really, really good at something for the first couple of years that you're working on it or working toward achieving something, and then you get stuck, I guess. And so you're like, I'm not good at this anymore, and you quit. But really, you just needed to keep moving forward and keep progressing, or pause, as you talk about in the next section.
Right. Yeah. I think that's right. That often as you get better at something, the margin between where you are and where your potential is shrinks, and so then to make incremental improvements is just harder because there aren't as many strategies that will lead you closer to that potential that you're trying to reach.
Mhm. So in this section, you also approach kind of any traps and lures to be aware of, and I loved your example of your name. That you opened with your name, how nobody was named Adam until the same exact year that you were named Adam. Uh,
Yeah.
but how do traps and lures actually cause us to be stuck? How, like, is it are they just an illusion of forward progress?
Yeah, so there are very specific sets of traps that are sort of typical of the way humans approach the world. And one of them is when something seems small or trivial, instead of dealing with it today, even though it might become magnified later on, we often just let it be and say, I'll deal with this tomorrow. And that's often where we end up getting stuck, because this thing that was small and surmountable at one point festers and becomes worse. And there are all sorts of examples in the book and elsewhere, some of them quite tragic and some of them just kind of frustrating.
Mhm.
A great example of this is the Y2K bug, which governments knew about from the 50s and 60s, did nothing about, and then in the 90s spent billions of dollars dealing with a problem that they could have dealt with much more easily with a small tweak in computer operating systems when there were very few computers in the 60s. So this is it's an emblem for that kind of tendency to let things just go. There's also this illusion that things are further away than they are, and when they're far enough away, we just can't imagine they'll ever actually land, they'll ever arrive. And so if something's a problem, but it's going to be a problem in the future, we often just say, all right, when it gets closer, I'll figure it out. So all of these problems are essentially humans apportioning their energy in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. That you can deal with this thing by spending 5 minutes today, or you can say that 5 minutes today is really precious. I'm going to retain it for some other purpose, but then you're going to have to spend hours or days or months and often much, much more money dealing with the problem when it arrives.
Is there any strategy behind kind of, even, I know, at work you're going to outline the things that you should do in order of importance, but even like a life strategy like that?
Yeah, I think the heart of the book is this idea that I call a friction audit.
Hmm.
And a friction audit is essentially a kind of habitual, algorithmic, routine process that deals with the uncertainties of life in a way that's much more systematic and consistent. And so I think one of the most useful things someone in my position can do is to say, here are 10 things that feel like they're beyond our control and they're unpredictable. But if you have processes in place that head them off at the pass before they become a big deal, that really force you into a position where you're stuck, then why not use those processes? And the friction audit is designed to do that. It's basically designed to say, if you spend a few hours, maybe say once a month, looking at your life, look at your finances, your relationships, your career, if you're a parent, your relationship with your kids, whatever the dimensions are that matter in your life, look at those things, examine them for points where there's a bit of friction. Something's just not quite right. Something should be done perhaps. And then you can decide, do I want to intervene, or is this something that I can kick the can down the road and I'll figure it out later on? But even knowing what the menu of problems might look like is 10 steps ahead of most people. And so I think that's just a generally valuable approach, is to have an algorithm or a habitual approach where you have every month, 2 months, 3 months, a certain set of processes. And I talk in the book about, I'm trying to remember the term, it's preventive maintenance, which is what you use with aircraft. If you took the aircraft out of the sky and every time you had to look at them, they were sitting on the tarmac for a week, that would be unacceptable because that would take them out of commission for too long. But what aircraft maintenance engineers do is they have A, B, C, and D checklists. A checklists are very perfunctory. They're brief. They happen every time a plane flies. They just check on really major issues that might be sticking out. D checks at the other end of the spectrum. That happens maybe once every 5 years in the life of an aircraft. The aircraft is grounded, put in a hangar. Engineers take a very close look at everything. But this set of different checks from A to D, and they change in size and how much of an effect they have on the operation of the aircraft, are all designed to figure out whether there's an issue before it happens. And I think we can apply a version of that to our lives in the form of that friction audit.
Wonderful advice. I think that you're right, because then you can also better handle change when it gets thrown at you if you already kind of have this process in place.
Exactly.
So we have a couple of questions about friction audits. Alicia says, can you speak to the role that trauma, which we all experience to one degree or another, plays in the way the three sources of friction show up in our life? How does the friction audit address the friction that arises due to traumatic experiences?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think trauma is one of those external forces, usually. I mean, most trauma is external. There's something that happens outside of yourself that you don't invite in, that you don't control, and that you then have to fold into the rest of your life and figure out how you're going to move forward in the context of that new version of what the world looks like to you. And I think that is a major sticking point for a lot of people, and it's a major psychological sticking point. In the book, one of the things I talk about is that people very quickly jump to action when they're trying to get unstuck. They kind of flail. And that's true of trauma as well. You want to do something different. You want to sort of act in a way that makes it feel like you have control in a situation where perhaps you've lost some control. But there's a danger in acting before you deal with the emotional consequences of that stuckness. And so if trauma is producing stuckness, that's a particularly complicated, complex kind of emotional stuckness that you might need to see a therapist. You might need to work through the process in other ways, whatever happens to apply in this particular case. But you can't get to doing things, to acting and having strategies until you manage the emotional consequences of experiencing that trauma. So I think it's really important that emotional side of getting unstuck is dealt with first. And that's especially true, for example, in the case of trauma, where the stuckness is essentially rooted in emotion and in the response you have to this external stimulus that shocked you into a new reality. But it's an important question.
Thank you. Melinda would like to know, what tools or resources do you advocate or recommend to help with the friction audit?
Yeah, there's I mean, in the book, I talk about the process. It's essentially 3 steps. I think the most useful thing is to keep in mind those 3 steps. The 3 steps are essentially you're exploring. So there's an exploratory step where you're trying to identify the sources of friction. And the simple question to ask yourself is, are there aspects of this thing that don't function as fluently and as freely as I would like? And a lot of it's emotional. It's a very sort of gut level response. Like, do I feel happy in the relationships I'm in my job? Do things feel like they're flowing freely, or am I anxious about my finances? How do I feel about my relationships with friends, and so on? And so that's the first step, is trying to identify those friction points. The second step is the intervention phase, where you decide if you're going to do something about it. Are you going to intervene, and how would you do that? And then the third step is confirming over a period of months afterwards whether that has been an effective intervention. Has that helped you in some way? Now, the devil's in the details, right? That process of identifying them, the process of intervening, and the process of verifying that you've been successful takes a little bit of doing. And I try to unpack some of that in the book. But I often work with people or with organizations for very long periods of time to go through the minutiae of the process. But it's certainly something I do, and it's something that I talk about at a pretty high level in the book. But the basic ideas that I think get you 90% of the way there are captured in the book.
Good. Thank you. There's another section there's another concept that you talk about in the heart part of the book called pause before you play. And you give a couple of examples about elite athletes. I especially loved the Andre Agassi example. Pausing and literally like finding out physically what his opponent was doing by sticking out his tongue. I laughed out loud when I read that one. But can you talk about what you mean when you say pause before you play?
Yeah, this goes back to that same instinct to flail, to kind of act impulsively and quickly, and not to let even a moment pass before you start wrestling with whatever it is that's making you feel stuck. And I like the purity of sports as a domain to investigate these questions, because when you're playing a sport, whether it's a 90-minute soccer match, whether it's a 3 or 5 set tennis match, whatever it is, there's a sort of finite space in which to perform. And you have to decide when you're going to perform in those contexts, how to apportion your energy and what to do with each point or each minute of the game, or whatever, however you divide the contest. And the two examples I focus on in the book, I focus on Agassi and his willingness to let, he was playing against Boris Becker in the 80s and 90s. And Becker had this absolutely killer serve that Agassi could not return. And the first 3 matches they played, Becker just destroyed him because Agassi had no way to get his serve back, and he couldn't break Becker's serve. Now, Agassi was well known as a great returner of serve. And part of what made him a great returner of serve was his instincts. He was very quick. He had great reflexes. But there was much more than that was actually grounded in strategy. And what he would do, and what he did very effectively with Becker, he ended up winning the next 9 of their 11 matches they played, because what he did was he said, I wanted to sacrifice a few points. I was willing to let Becker serve a game sort of uncontested, but I was going to spend that game investigating every single little thing that I could see from my side of the net as I watched him serve. And he discovered this incredible thing, that when Becker served, his tongue popped out of his mouth and indicated where the ball was going. Becker didn't even know this was happening. Wow. Years later, they had a conversation, and Becker said, what happened? I smashed you in these three games. My serve was unstoppable, and then you beat me after that. What happened? And Agassi said, well, here's the story. And Becker was floored. He couldn't believe it. And he had said to his wife earlier on, I don't understand it. It's like he's reading my mind. He knows exactly where I'm going to serve before I even serve. And so this little the tell was available to every single player, but only Agassi was the one who was willing to stop, investigate, observe. And so the moral there, the sort of parable, is directed towards slowing down, pausing, sacrificing now for later. I also talk a little bit about Lionel Messi, the soccer player, who does the same thing. He doesn't essentially play much in the first 3 to 5 minutes of every match he plays, because he's surveying the territory. He's getting a sense of the lay of the land. And that makes him more effective for the remaining 85 minutes. But where everyone else is running around from the minute the whistle blows, he stands still and he just watches. And so this tendency to pause and let the thing unfold, partly to calm yourself down, which is true for Messi, but also partly because it's strategically beneficial, is incredibly powerful. And I think not enough of us do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are very powerful examples. Jennifer wants to know, are you always, is being stuck always a sign that you should pause, or could it also be a sign that you're heading in the right direction toward a breakthrough?
Definitely doesn't always mean you should pause. I think pausing is when you're stuck initially. Like the first moment you say, this is not working. You're Andre Agassi, you don't know how to deal with this situation. You're Lionel Messi, you're deeply anxious about playing soccer matches. Now what do we do? And the first thing you do then is pause. That's a really good first step, is figure things out, slow things down, turn down the temperature essentially. But in the long run, once you're acting, once you have a strategy and you're pursuing the strategy, you have essentially 2 options, right? Maybe you have 3. One option is to continue on, maybe past the point where you think to yourself at first, maybe I should just stop and quit and do something else. The other option is to say, I'm going to quit. I'm going to do something else with my time. There are wonderful books written by wonderful authors on both of these ends of the spectrum. Like one book says, keep going. Another book says, you should quit because there are so many wonderful things to do in this life and we don't have that much time. And I think my reading of most situations is that we as a species tend to quit too soon. So in general, as a rule of thumb, spend roughly 30 to 50% more time on things that feel like they're not going quite as fast in the direction you'd like. And then if you decide after that extra expenditure that it's not working out, then you can move on to the next thing, knowing that you tried everything. But once you're moving along, I would say you don't need to pause. You can act, and act consistently.
And that might be to Mike's question here or comment, the differences between getting free from daily obstacles and lifelong ones. Maybe some of those lifelong obstacles would be, it's time to quit. I don't know if that's the right advice. But the daily ones maybe just pause, because they're things that you have to do with everyday life. Is there a difference between those two?
Yeah, there is. We didn't really define what I meant by stuck, but I think this is important too, that the daily kind of momentary frustrations, I'm not as interested in those in this book. I think they're important and they have a big part to play in our lives. I don't know that I would describe those as being stuck as much as just the human condition, part of what it is to be alive. Like, it's kind of annoying, I don't want to work today, or today I'm frustrated by this thing that in 10 minutes won't frustrate me anymore. I think those punctuate our lives constantly. I'm interested in them a little bit, but I'm much more interested in the more protracted forms of stuckness that last months or years, that are really like a big part of our lives, where when you interview people, and I've been doing this survey now across hundreds of 200 countries, almost every country, with thousands of people, the things they say really occupy their time and attention are big stuckness that lasts those months and years. And they're willing to pay a lot of money there. So they're willing to pay a huge proportion of their assets to solve those forms of stuckness. So yes, definitely a different strategy for the momentary ones versus the big ones. And I think one of the questions to ask is this an optional stuckness? If you've been stuck for a year, there are stucknesses that are kind of, they're not optional. You have to grapple with them in some way. And the productive thing is to figure out a solution that's workable. And there are others where it's really just a matter of whether you want to make the decision to abandon this thing that's causing the stuckness and move on to something else. It might be a new career, it might be a new relationship, it might be a new friendship, it might be some other thing, a hobby that you're pursuing where you're not making progress. Obviously, if it's a stuckness that's something like a medical situation, or it's something that deals with a family member, you may not have the option to walk away. But if you do, after a year or 2 or 5 years, maybe it is time to stop learning to play the trumpet or whatever it is that's causing you anguish. And it's just a matter of working out the importance of that domain in your life and whether you can move on with something else instead.
So what role then does, I guess Josie wants to know, what role does your own vulnerability play in stuckness and enacting change? Is there a solid predictor of sustained and successful change when it comes to being unstuck?
Yeah, there is. I think that being stuck is a subjective experience. It can be objective. It can be, I've learned 1,000 words of French and I wish I knew 10,000 more, but I can't. That's subjective. You can point to the number of words you've learned, your vocab. But there's also, and I think much of the time, there's a very strong subjective element to being stuck, and vulnerability plays a big role in this. So I had this great conversation with the writer Malcolm Gladwell about his dad, who was a mathematician and passed away a few years ago. And his dad wrestled with the same intellectual mathematical problem for about 3 decades. And from the outside, objectively, he didn't make a lot of progress. He wasn't finding new massive insights or breakthroughs, but he was energized and excited, and he woke up every day delighted to be doing what he was doing as a math professor, grappling with this problem. So objectively, he was stuck. He wasn't making progress. Subjectively, though, he didn't feel in any way stuck. He felt like he was exactly where he wanted to be. I think vulnerability is the opposite of what Malcolm's dad felt. Vulnerability is feeling that you are subjectively in a place where you don't want to be, or where you're susceptible to becoming stuck. It can be other things too. I obviously don't know the usage of the term vulnerability there. It could be about being unwilling to grapple with stuckness, or it could be saying, I'm vulnerable because I'm exposing myself to the prospects of failure. And that's a separate thing. And again, Malcolm's dad was happy to fail in the objective sense, because he was enjoying what he was doing. But there are times when we feel too vulnerable to expose ourselves to assessment, to examination. And that vulnerability can turn you away from doing something that might unstick you.
Right. That's very important. Matt's wondering if people's fear of stuckness, maybe on the opposite side of the spectrum, can lead them into patterns of extreme spontaneity or a constant search for the next great stimulus.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's often how we get stuck, is by being restless by bouncing from one thing to the next, because a lot of the benefits of things come later. Now, that's one of the again, going back to the basic features of the human condition, we are presentists, which basically means we prioritize now over the future. And so if I can do something that's going to make me feel good right now, I'm just going to turn to my phone in this minute, because it's going to be, we often call them adult pacifiers, because they function like pacifiers for children. Yes, I will waste the next minute doing that rather than figuring out the thing that will make me happier in the long run. And if you string together enough minutes like that, suddenly you've lost hours of your day and years of your life. And that's how we often are. And I think that flailing, that bouncing from one thing to the next, is a privileging of the now over the longer term. And so to become really good at something, there's quite a lot written about this and it's well studied. You've got to spend time, and you often find that the good stuff comes later. There's an idea I talk about in the book called the creativity cliff illusion, or the creative cliff illusion. And the idea there is that when you ask people, if you're trying to come up with creative ideas, like let's say I gave you a paperclip and said, think of as many creative uses for this as you can. Do you think the best uses will come quickly in the first 5 or 10, or will they take time? Will they be use number 25 or 30 or 35? And almost everyone says, if it's not coming up quickly, it's not coming up at all. It's probably not going to be a good idea later on. So the best ideas come first. That is not true. All the kind of staid, trite, boring ideas that everyone else has, they come up first. Then it gets really hard. But if you push through the hardness, you persevere instead of bouncing to the next thing, that's where the payoff comes. And because we pay so much attention to the hardness of what it's like to come up with idea 12, 13, 14, 15, we often abandon the task when the good stuff is just around the corner. And so persevering, again, that 30 to 50% more than you might expect is really, really important in general for not living a life of a string of stucknesses.
I misspoke earlier when I was talking about pause before you play being in the head section. So I apologize for that. That was in the heart section, everybody. But you did just bring up the kind of the creative cliff example, and it makes me think of recombination. Kind of that same kind of thing, recombination as a strategy for getting unstuck. And this is back in part 3 in the head section. Is that kind of a similar thing where you have people are always striving for radical originality, but really kind of maybe idea 25 might just be a recombination of ideas 5.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. I think radical originality is about where you set your threshold for acceptable ideas, whether it's a business or some other creative pursuit. We generally just strive for truly radically original products and ideas and concepts. And that's true if you're writing a book, and it's true if you're writing music, and it's true if you're creating a new product for the marketplace. Doesn't matter what it is. And that sort of, when we fetishize originality, it's really dangerous because it sets an incredibly high bar. There is very little that is genuinely original that doesn't in some way borrow from something that came before. And in the book, I try to make that argument pretty strongly, that essentially, another way of saying it is that everything is a remix, that everything is essentially taking old elements and recombining them in ways that are new. And I challenge my students when I teach marketing at NYU, these are MBA students, I challenge them to come up with radically original products. And then we talk about whether they are. Do they stand on the shoulders of other products? Are they combinations of other products? Almost always the answer is yes. It's very, very hard to find something that's radically original. So I think that's a really big thing when striving for newness or novelty, is that we get stuck looking for something original when we would do much better to just have this is what I do. I have an ongoing journal, a series of journals that collect good ideas, other people's good ideas, occasionally mine, but often other people's. And then when I'm looking for a new concept or a new research topic or something like that, I will go to this well of ideas and I will say, hey, no one's ever combined idea 3 with idea 27. Let's see if we can do that. And it's a really generative way of being creative. And I think it's very valuable, and it describes how most good ideas arise.
Yeah, I agree with that. Speaking of being in your head, Elizabeth wants to know how much of getting stuck can actually just be related to you being a perfectionist.
Huge amount. Huge amount. Yeah, perfectionism is really destructive, unfortunately. And one of the problems with perfectionism is also very present focused. So perfectionism says I've got to do the perfect thing and I've got to do it now. Whereas a long-term view says that there is a good enough, this is known as satisficing versus maximizing. Maximizing is like, I will only accept the very best right now on all dimensions. Satisficing is much healthier, and it's where you say there is a good enough. And depending on the domain, good enough will be at different levels. You know, if you're trying to choose which partner to settle down with, that might be good enough, might be really, it's got to be pretty good. But if it's like which car to buy, for me at least, I'm not a huge car person. I just want a car that checks certain boxes. I could spend days being paralyzed by the decision, or I can say the first one that comes along that checks the boxes is good enough. And so that decision is I think whether you should maximize and become a perfectionist really should be domain specific. I think it's worth being a perfectionist about really, really important decisions, but most of them, they are either revocable or they can be improved upon across time. And one of the anecdotes that I love here is Jeff Tweedy, the front man from the band Wilco, talks about really the complexities associated with being a creative over a period of many decades, that you essentially wake up every day and your job, such as it is to come up with good ideas, whether he's writing a book or writing music. And that's demanding, right? That's asking the best of yourself every day. And if you're a perfectionist, that is punishing. And a lot of writers, musicians, they talk about this. That's where writer's block comes from and creative blocks come from. But Tweedy doesn't entertain that. I love his approach. He basically says, I wake up some days and I'm like, it's not happening. So what he does instead is he'll say, I'm going to spend the first 30 minutes lowering the bar of what's acceptable. If perfectionism's up here and his usual bar is here, he lowers the bar all the way to the ground. And he says to himself, anything is fine. What is the worst sentence I could write now? What is the worst musical phrase I could write? And in the process of creating that bad musical phrase or sentence, he's creating, he's not stuck by definition. And so the wheel starts turning and some good ideas emerge. Some of those ideas that he thinks are bad actually turn out to be better than he expected. But even if they are bad, he's no longer stuck. And he's gone from this inertia of being stuck at zero to rolling along at 20 miles an hour, which is much closer to the 30 or 40 or 50 he wants to achieve. And so being a non-perfectionist in the moment and accepting really bad stuff now in the service of the future of an hour down the line is the source of a lot of his success. And I think we could all learn something from that. So perfectionism is the opposite, and it's destructive.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue into habit, right? And you talk about experimentation, and that kind of sounds like what Jeff Tweedy does in order to remain unstuck. Just lowers the bar completely, and what's the worst thing that I could write right now? And that's experimenting toward a breakthrough. And April would like to know, are there ways to stay focused on this without in order to get into the new habit, because I know you have to change these kind of ingrained habits. So how do you prevent yourself from backsliding?
Yeah, so with experimentalism, one of the things I've always been curious about is I'm a social psychologist by training, which means I'm interested in how situations shape our experience of the world. So if someone says this person experienced a trauma, then I'm going to ask, like, what was the trauma and what happened and how does that situation affect things? Or do we all behave the same way in response to a situation? Like, did we all in some ways respond similarly to the pandemic or something like that? That's my tradition. But then the flip side of that is personality. Are people just different? Are some people different from others in meaningful ways? And in the domain of stuckness, there are some people who just don't seem to get stuck, not in the way we recognize it. And I wanted to understand those people and to find them. And it's always, I think, an interesting quest is to find the very best at something. And in this case, it's the best at remaining unstuck. And these people tend to be experimentalists. They are people who've adopted a philosophy of essentially saying, I'm always going to question whether this thing is really the best. I'm curious. And that's what children do. So children, certainly, I have a 6 and 7-year-old. Those kids, they're wonderful, but they'll often say, I'm a little bit bored. Like, what am I going to do now? But they're also incredibly curious and inventive, and they don't get stuck very often. There are those periods of boredom, but mostly they don't get stuck because they're always asking questions. They're trying to better any situation. Adults lose that at some point, most of us. But these experimentalists have this habit of saying, is there a good reason that we're all following the orthodoxy here? Like there's a herd of us doing the same thing. Should we be? Or is there a good reason to question it? Should we all be working 5 days a week, 8 hours a day? Like there's a historical reason for that. Is that the right way to do things, or should we experiment with alternatives and so on? So the question about habit and getting into the sort of the flow of this kind of thing, if it's not the way you normally do things, is to make it routine in some way. Like one thing you can do is you can say, I'm going to spend, and I know we're all busy, spend an hour once a month questioning the strategies that I use in my life to get things done. And that could be, everyone's different, so I don't know what specifics are going on in anyone's life, but like my commute is the way that I get from my home in Connecticut to New York City where I teach. Should I experiment? Once a month, is it worth considering alternatives? Is there a different way I could go? Should I go at a different time? Maybe for 2 weeks, I'll try something different. That kind of continual push for change is grounded in asking the right questions. And you can set a calendar alert that comes up once a month and says, today is our experimentalist day, and we're going to think about this thing for an hour. And so I think that's just a valuable way to make those things habits, is to insert them into your schedule.
Do you think that the old adage of if you do anything for 30 days in a row, it becomes a habit, is there any truth to that as far as it pertains to unstuck behaviors? I mean, is there something that you can follow from A to Z and then it's a habit?
There's a kernel of truth, but it depends on the thing you're trying to turn into a habit. Some domains it takes longer than others. Some take 15 days, some take hundreds of days. It also depends on the individual. Some people become creatures of habit really fast and some people don't. And so there's a huge amount of variance depending on these different factors. But habit comes from repetition. So that's the kernel that's true, whether it's 30 days or some other period. Consistency is absolutely critical. And so doing something over and over, whether it's at a monthly interval or a daily interval or an hourly interval, whatever it might be, is really the things that are important to you. You should be scheduling them in and scheduling them at regular intervals.
We had quite a few questions from people about advice and strategies for those who are 60 plus and retiring, and how to navigate kind of the landscape of stuckness at a retirement age, especially when technology kind of gets in the way.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it's a period of tremendous opportunity. And when I think about, I won't be retiring for a little while. If I have my say, it'll be a few years. But I do think a lot about what that first day is going to look like. I actually worked on a big campaign with a company where they were talking about trying to make people imagine that first day of retirement. We filmed a little video and we actually hypnotized people in their 20s to believe. This is a crazy thing we did. We hypnotized them to believe it was the first day of retirement. And it was really interesting watching them grapple with that situation. These people who are objectively 20, imagining that they're in their 60s or 70s, and some of them in their 80s. And you say to them, so how is it to be retired? And the range of responses goes from, I'm so excited. There are so many things I want to do. I've got a menu of things that I want to do. I want to become an expert in this thing that I just never had time for before. I want to travel. Obviously, health matters a lot, right? If you're healthy, you can do many more things. If you have money, you can do many more things. Right. But still, even without money, you can do plenty. But some of them were energized and excited. And then there were these people in their 20s, imagining they were in their 60s or 70s, crestfallen. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I feel stuck. I'm paralyzed. Like, what am I supposed to do next? And so I think a huge amount of it is to the extent your life permits, whatever the constraints are in your life, how much you can move physically, how much money you have, who else is in your life. Do you have a partner? Do you have family members that ground you to a particular place? Can you travel? What things interest you? Is there a language you've been wanting to learn your whole life? Are there skills that you kind of have to a degree of 50%? You want to get to 80%? I find that menu of options tremendously energizing. Like, how am I going to spend the time that I now have that I didn't have before? And so I think a lot of it is mindset based. It's driven a lot by curiosity, by experimentalism. And you can't be afraid to try something and find that it's just not what you want to be doing. I think knowing that is really important. And so for me in retirement, that's key. Is, do I want to spend every day playing golf? Maybe. But if I spend 3 weeks playing golf and I realize it's not for me, or I only want to do it once a month, so be it. But you don't know until you try. And so I think that's important.
I kind of feel like that's where like perfectionism or even laziness can come into the spectrum when you're trying to figure out, do I not like it because I'm not very good at it and I'm just being a perfectionist? Or do I not like it because I have to get up and go somewhere to do it?
Yeah, it's so true. I think a lot about this, and some of my research does focus on the long-term consequences of aging and retirement and so on. I'm interested in those processes. I had a friend in Australia 25 years ago whose grandpa was a former High Court judge in Australia. So there are, at any point in time, there are 7 High Court judges. It's like the Supreme Court. And he was known as one of the greats. You know, they sort of rank judges in terms of how great they are. He was a great judge. And I spoke to him when he was in his late 90s, and he was sharp as anything. It was incredible. It was like talking to the version of him that I had seen publicly when he was a judge 30 years earlier. And I asked him, like, how are you so engaged with everything that's going on, and why? And I asked his granddaughter, who was my friend, like, what's the deal that he's so incredibly sharp? And she said, yeah, and he's friends with a lot of the other judges. And she said to me, the ones who are engaged, who keep using parts of their minds that they used before they retired, they retain those faculties in a way that people who decide, I'm just too lazy and I'm just going to let it go, I'm retired, I don't need to do that anymore, they lose it really much quicker. So some of the judges were like, I'm done being a judge. I was very good at it, but I'm done. And the others were like, I'm going to keep reading, I'm going to keep exploring, I'm going to take classes. He traveled constantly. That's how you stay vibrant. And I think that's really important in retirement as well, is not to basically say, now I have all this free time and I'm going to use it to be idle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a huge difference. I've known so many people who retire, and after just a month of retirement, they're trying to start working again because they need to do something.
Exactly.
So Beverly wants to know, what role does risk or the fear of risk play in becoming unstuck? So how can a person learn to trust their ability to assess risk?
Yeah, I think as humans, we generally assume that moves that we make and decisions we take are more irrevocable than they are. That once we've made a decision, that's the be all and end all, and it's either going to work out or we're in trouble. And that's not how many things work in life. Like, there are some decisions, like having a child is a forever decision. Yeah. But there are a lot of decisions, like career decisions, are on some level revocable or tweakable. You can switch things a little bit, sometimes a lot. Friendship-based decisions, financial decisions, you can often recover from decisions that don't go the way you'd like. And so I think a lot of risk assessment, when it's realistic and when it's done well, is a matter of distinguishing the decisions that are really, really important, in part because they can't be shifted once they've been made, and the ones that it turns out this is revocable. Like, the worst case scenario isn't all that bad, or if it is, it's something I can change. And so I think it's really important to have that lens, which I think for most people dulls that sense that you want to avoid all risk, because often you have to take what we would describe as risk, or at least embrace uncertainty when getting unstuck, because you're trying something different, and you have to, and you don't know how it's going to work out sometimes. So you need at least a taste for risk and risk seeking if you're in that position.
Amy's wondering what you would suggest as far as steps if you are stuck, on what direction you want to take with an aspect of your life. So, like profession, for example. What steps do you suggest on getting unstuck?
Yeah, so we haven't touched on this yet, but in the last part of the book on action or habit, I talk about the distinction between exploration and exploitation.
Yeah,
these are two different approaches to making change, essentially, or making decisions or gathering information. And the terms come from evolutionary biology. And the theory is that, imagine you were a hunter-gatherer many thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. You come out onto the plain, a big plain, there's a grass everywhere, there are some scattered trees, there's some scattered water, there are some caves, and you've never seen this territory before, but you know that it's important that you find food. You have essentially two strategies. One is exploration, which is where you say, I want to cover as much of this land as possible. But obviously, because I want to cover as much of it as possible, I can't go deeply into every area to really investigate exactly what's going on there. So I'm going to run around and try to figure out as much as possible what's happening. That's exploration. Exploitation is where, after doing that, you say, there's a watering hole. I noticed a couple of animals there. That seems fruitful. There's a cave that I find quite interesting, and there's some berries that seem to be growing in this one little patch. I'm going to devote all of my time tomorrow to just digging as deeply as I can into those 3 areas that seem fruitful. But you don't know those areas exist until you explore. So you can't exploit before you've explored. Mm-hmm. And this exploration-exploitation distinction is important because it's difficult to do both of those things simultaneously. You have to decide, am I in exploration mode or am I in exploitation mode? And a lot of career building and getting unstuck rests on knowing how to explore, how to exploit, and when to transition from one to the other. And there are some incredible examples of this. Like, people we see as the greatest talents in certain areas have done this often unwittingly, and that produced this golden period in their careers. So Jackson Pollock, if you look at the works he produced before he got into his drip painting era, the era that he became famous for, that made him tons of money and made him wealthy and famous and successful in all the kind of conventional ways, he looked like a kind of schizophrenic mix of 15 other artists, because every day he would try something new. He was exploring. You look at his portfolio, the 10 years before he started to exploit this drip painting technique, and it is impossibly diverse. There's cubist work, there's fauvist work, there's expressionist work, there's impressionist work. You can't pin down an identity, but he was searching. And the minute he hit on the drip painting technique, he said, I need to exploit this. And so for a period of 7 years, that's all he did. And so that's, I think, a really good model for developing these hot streaks or great periods in our lives, is knowing that there are periods when we say yes to everything. I'm going to try everything that I possibly can. I tell the freshmen at NYU this in some talks I give, that this is your period of exploring. Say yes to everything, because who knows what's going to be worthwhile. But then you have to switch into exploitation mode, because you'll never get anywhere without it. And so I think that's a great kind of general rule of thumb, that you want to start with exploration, move to exploitation. And then if you're exploiting and you hit a kind of wall that you're not getting any further and you want to try again, you go back to exploration mode. And so you kind of bounce between them. You can also have like 4 days a week where you do one and 1 day the other. It doesn't have to be so hard and fast. But it's a really useful distinction to understand the difference between those two modes.
It makes me think of musicians and like one-hit wonders. Like they have these huge one-hit, like they're on the Billboard charts, and then you never hear from them again. And so it then makes me think of barriers that might be there in that exploitation process, something like a record label not picking up anything else that they've written. So how do you overcome external barriers in your to your unstuckness?
Yeah, commercial success in the music world is a very lumpy process, where a very teeny tiny proportion of musicians are financially and commercially successful beyond a 1 hit, or even beyond 0 hits. It's pretty rare. Like, most musicians don't make a ton of money being a musician.
Right.
There's one Taylor Swift, there just aren't that many people making an absolute killing and being financially and commercially successful in that world. I think that base rate is important, because if I look at the students that are at NYU in the business school, and a lot of them end up being quite financially successful, if that's the metric that's important. I don't know how many of them are happy in their careers, because I don't assess that and I don't get a chance to, but they pursue careers where like 50% of people in this career end up being quite comfortable financially. That's not true of musicians. So that's part of the sticking point, is that sort of that decision. If you're going to become a musician, you've got to know, just as Brie Larson did, that there is a good chance that this is going to be, it's going to be tough to make it big. And that's okay, but you need to just be realistic about that fact. So the base rates count against you. Now, the one-hit wonder phenomenon is really interesting. And I think there are different models of one-hits. Like, there's the one hit that is just a bolt from the blue. It just somehow there's something about a particular chord progression or melody or series of instruments that go together in a way that's ethereally beautiful. No one can replicate it. And unfortunately, nor can the artist who created it. It was just this one great thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think one-hit wonders, what happens is you hit this vein of gold, and instead of exploiting that and making more of that thing and figuring out if there's a kernel that you can then reproduce, I think a lot of artists then go to the next thing, and they go too far from what was successful. And that's often where that becomes a one hit rather than something that can be unspooled. In academia, we call this being programmatic, taking something that works and figuring out a program around it. And the best academics in terms of their productivity and so on are people who say, here's a good idea, and here are the 1,000 things that come on that can be derived from it. And that's, I think, something that some musicians miss.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Just moving on and away from the thing that was the wonder to begin with kind of feels like a different kind of stuckness.
Right.
So we did get a couple of questions about AI and stuckness. So I saw an interview that you gave ChatGPT saying that ChatGPT can serve as kind of this agent of chaos and help you unlock your best ideas. And Dane is asking, how can AI help people get unstuck with writing and creative projects? Are our phones and other distractions the major culprit to causing us to put off and fail to complete projects? Any long-term strategies?
Great question. Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, if any of you watching have not used ChatGPT, you should. You should spend an hour or 5 hours or 10 hours going down the rabbit hole and asking the Gen AI engine questions. It doesn't matter what the questions are, but ask it to do some things, and you'll get a sense of the breadth of what it can do, how it responds to certain prompts. But more than just giving it a series of unrelated prompts, dig deeper. So here's an example of how I think it can be an incredible brainstorming partner. If I'm writing a book, I have a vague sense of what I'm trying to do. So at the beginning of writing the book, if I craft a proposal, in the case of Anatomy of a Breakthrough, the proposal looks very much like the finished book. I have other books where that's not true. So things get refined over time. But if you're in that phase between the broad sense of the book and then the book coming into fruition, there's a lot of room for bouncing ideas off something that's intelligent, whether it's a human or a Gen AI engine. So here's one thing you could do. You could say, I'm about to write a chapter on the concept of recombination. Recombination is taking two old ideas and merging them in a way that makes something new. You could say to the engine that give it that little précis, and then you could say, based on that information, how would I give me 3 different ways to start a chapter on the idea of recombination? And then it might spool out. It might say, you could say each one being 300 words or something like that. Starting to write a chapter in a book is really hard. I'm not saying you plagiarize and take what it's given you, but it jogs your mind and says, oh, here are 3 different approaches. And then you could say, well, I like the second one, but I'd like it written in a slightly different style. Like, take that text, paste it, and say, could you please rewrite this in a way that makes it sound more colloquial? Or can you find a story that illustrates this idea from the world of music or sports or whatever? And suddenly you have, I have some very smart people that I turn to when I'm writing a book, and I'll ask them questions and we'll bounce ideas off each other. But all those people are busy. They're not always available. But ChatGPT is always there. And it's a great brainstorming partner that agglomerates all of this information from thousands of sources. So I think it's a great brainstorming partner.
Yeah, I never even thought of it as a brainstorming thing. I would just think of it as, well, I've had students turn in papers that were written by ChatGPT. So
yeah, me too.
I'm sure. Okay, so very last question. Everybody always wants to know, what are you reading right now that they should run to their libraries and check out?
Oh, God. I wish I'd prepared an answer to that question. I'm looking around. I feel like I need to open my Kindle app so I can tell you what I'm reading. Let me see what's in here. I always have the worst memory for this question. I'm currently reading the Walter Isaacson biography of Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah.
I'm reading Knausgaard's My Struggle, which I've been meaning to read forever, and then I had kids, and so that slowed things down. I reread The Road by Cormac McCarthy because when he died, I wanted to reread a lot of his work. I'm rereading some of David Grann's work. I mean, these are not, I wish these were sort of left field and that no one had thought of them, but I'm rereading Killers of the Flower Moon. And then I'm reading some stuff for work that's work-based. I told you about Bruce Feiler early on, this idea of life quakes. He has a newer book called The Search, which is about finding meaning in what he calls a post-career world. And he is an incredibly entertaining person, very, very well-spoken, very interesting, has an interesting life. So I will stop there. I've got a lot more in here, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for your profound work. I know that everybody got a lot out of the talk today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you for the last hour, so thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Brandon, and thanks to all of you for joining.
I also want to extend a huge thank you in kind to our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, of course, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Adam's book in that resources tab. We look forward to seeing you all on September 27th when we talk to international bestselling author Amor Tolls, and again on October 10th with Rick Steves as he imparts his top tips and tricks for European travel. So you can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us.